Alright, so welcome to week 6 and 7, our motor and pump activity. What we've got in front of us here is everything we'll need to do our first week's activity. Before we get to the electrical measurements, the teams are going to take apart and put back together these pumps, and so we're going to ask you to put them back together in the way you got them. But once that's done, we're going to have you take some electrical measurements on how much energy it takes just to run the pump when it doesn't have any water in it. And so that's what we're going to go over right now. So we're going to make the assumption that you put the pump back together and then you're ready to make the electrical measurements. So the other supply, we've got our board here that we're going to use the rest of the term, and it is powered by a DC power source that plugs into the outlet strip. And so you can see that 12-volt power supply provides energy to the board. The 12-volt power supply has a plus and a ground, and so 12 volts comes out and hooks into the one of the rails on the side of this breadboard, and then the ground comes in on the other side. So all of the terminals on the red side are positive 12 volts, and all the terminals on the blue side are ground. So we can use those to power our motors. All right. So our 2 metering items that we're going to need to do is voltage and current. So first let's talk about the circuit that we're going to draw, that we're going to create. So basically it's like a light bulb circuit. So we start out with a battery or a power supply. In our case it's 12 volts and ground. You can call the bottom side. Alright, we're going to come out of that and go out. We want to measure the current in the system. So and the way a current meter is described is with an A for amps. And then we go out to a little switch, and then out of that switch down to our motor. So I'm going to put an M inside the motor, and that motor is tied to a pump, and it'll just go pump here. So this is the combination we're testing this week. Out of the motor, and it has a red terminal on it for 12 volts, and then another terminal that comes off. Out of there, back to the power supply and up to ground. So this is our circuit. This will make the pump run. Alright, so the other meter that we want to do is a voltmeter, and so it's just going to make contact with the power supply at the positive side and the ground side. And so right now we're going to wire this up and go through this process, and then we'll take some measurements of voltage and current while it's running to see how much power it takes. So just as a reminder from your reading material, the power delivered to the motor is equal to the voltage times the current. And I is the symbol for current, and V is the symbol for voltage. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with this. So let's go ahead and wire up our voltmeter first. We've got the voltmeter, we need to set it to DC. Our power supply coming out of the wall is a DC power supply for 12 volts. Now we're going to connect the ground to one of our probes and the positive on volts to one of our probes. So we set the volts DC, that's the little flat symbol. You can see here there's a volts AC here with the sinusoid symbol. Alright, so these are the two terminals, volts in common. So on our breadboard we know that the positive is the red one here, and so we're going to go ahead and plug a wire in right next to that and then connect it to the positive of our power supply. So we're out of the power supply into the positive terminal of the voltmeter. Oops. Now you may have to clean these up a little bit to get them to stick in there right. But there we go, that's good. Now we're going to need a ground. So we're going to stick it on the negative side, or the ground side, and then connect our other probe to that. Alright, so that's back to our little picture here. So that's these two legs. We put the voltmeter touching the positive and the negative side, and if you look at our voltmeter here, it's reading 12.23 amps, or excuse me, 12.23 volts. Alright, so that's that piece. Now let's finish out the rest of we're going to go out of the power supply, through the ammeter, and create a switch and back through the motor. Here we go. So we're going to need to connect the wiring to the top of the motor. If you look on the top of the motor, there's a small red dot, and if we connect the red wire to that, and on the other side is our ground side, we'll slide on the black wire. Alright, so that gets those connected. So now let's make our other connections that we need. We're going to use a little white wire here to come out of positive. Alright, and we're going to go from the positive into one of our probes. and the other end of that probe is going to go into our ammeter. So the ammeter is a little bit different here. Set it up to measure DC amps. Again, the flat line means DC, and if you look on the other side here, there's an AC symbol for amps as well. There's two, a high current and a low current value. We're going to use the high current all the time unless the current is low, and we find that out after we test it with the high current. So we set it to amps and plug it into the 10 amp max range. All meters look about like this, and so if you have questions, you can ask your peer mentors. So now we're going into the meter, and we need to come out of the meter. So we'll plug in the black one through the common and grab that probe and bring it back. And remember, we're coming off the plus, and this needs to go to the plus side of the motor. And so the plus on the motor was the red wire. All right, so that gets us going out to the motor, through the motor, and back out on the black wire. So the black wire needs to go to the board, and then we're going to turn this on and off by jumping from ground over to this line where all these wires are touched together. So you can hear when I touch it together, the motor should come on. Okay, so this is going to end up being our switch right here. So we're going to plug it in next to it for now, and then when we want to turn it on, lift it over and plug it in. Okay, so let's walk through this one more time. We've got our voltmeter measuring the voltage available from the power supply. We've got current going out through the ammeter, through the motor, back through a switch. Now I did this a little out of order, but you can have the switch anywhere in the circuit that you want. And through the switch and then back to ground. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this. We've got them set up properly. If I jumper this over, you'll see the readings right here. And this one should drop down a little bit when the current starts flowing. And so we'll plug it in. 12.1 volts and 0.37.4 amps. And it's climbing because that pump is a little hot right now. So that's our basic measurements. We won't run them for very long without water in them. We'll do that the next week of this activity.
Water's about 7.